All right. Hello, everybody. This week, well, I'm still making my way through Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. As you can see, I've made some progress compared to the picture that I took on, I guess it must have been Friday or possibly Saturday. And, you know, I made less progress than. There we go. I made less progress than I otherwise might have made, but even if I had taken all of this reading and put it in here, I still wouldn't be done with this book. So, in the interest of keeping things going and actually continuing to put up reviews, we are talking about Diamonds Are Forever by Ian Fleming, which is the first James Bond book that I've ever read. My dad likes the movies, but he's not like a huge fan or anything. But I've seen snippets and bits of some of them. I think I saw the entirety of GoldenEye because GoldenEye was a game that everybody played when I was a kid, right? It was the N64 shooter par excellence, and so I ended up seeing that movie. I think I've seen one of the other. I think I might have seen Skyfall too. So those were both relatively new James Bond movies. Diamonds Are Forever is a much older one. I haven't seen that movie. And maybe I've seen some bits and pieces of it, but, never seen the whole thing. And, I haven't seen a James Bond film since Skyfall came out. So what have we got here? This is, the quintessential spy thriller series by Ian Fleming. This one in particular is a relatively short book at just over 200 pages. And, having seen enough of the movies to kind of get a feel for how they often go in a broad structural sense, I was very surprised by the fact that this book had almost zero action for the first practically half the book. Very dramatic and slow buildup. One of the things that I found interesting about this book is the way that, how to describe this? I have it written down here. Colorful character descriptions. And I think that might be the best way to put it. When Fleming is describing a character, in order to give you a vivid picture of that character, he comes up with a powerful color to demonstrate that character. So we have, among the cast of characters for this book, we have a blonde woman with dark gray eyes. He even most of this book doesn't use a lot of difficult words, I guess I'll say, but he uses a particular word to describe her eyes' color seeming to change based on the angle at which they reflect the light. But we have, among other characters, we have a red-headed hunchback, a white-haired assassin, a green-faced fat man. We get a lot of eye colors, we get a lot of hair colors, and I found that what these did, even though I wouldn't say that the characterization in this book is particularly strong, what these did was they gave you a flare of color or a flare of something to kind of grip onto and say, this is how I recognize this character. And I think that was fairly well done. The style of the book is fairly workmanlike prose. One thing I will say about it is that while Fleming's vocabulary in the book is fairly narrow, he doesn't try to use big words and he doesn't try to use, a thesaurus too much. Yet, even with the narrow vocabulary that he uses, it still feels notable in cases. It seems like the book is facing a wider, maybe even not very well-read audience. It's a book that's designed to be fun and not, something where you gaze at the prose and say, this is amazingly written. Of the things that Fleming does well, I would say the dramatic tension is one of them. The way that the tension is gradually and with a bit of ambiguity ratcheted up over the first half of the book is very interesting. We get some characters that we're not sure what kind of effect they're going to play in the story. We get some things that are not at all mysteries. The main plot of the book is not a mystery. It's not a mystery book at all. It's a thriller. And so we get Fleming sets down in the briefing to Bond who the bad guys are probably in this book fairly early on. There's not a lot of question about that, but we do get some questions about some of the motivations and some of the how certain characters are going to react to certain stimuli. I'll put it that way. The tone of the book is relatively matter-of-fact, Bond is kind of taciturn. He is not particularly emotional. And since we're seeing the action of the book through his eyes, we may get dramatic tension in the sense that we as the reader, and we as the reader looking through Bond's eyes, are not sure about who's going to do what when and what a reaction to this particular course of action is going to be. But we don't get really emotional tension in the sense that, like, I'm never really like, oh no, I'm so torn up over what might happen to this particular character. Things happen in a relatively straightforward way, and you're never really that surprised by it, except when things that don't seem like they ought to happen do happen, and I'll get more into that in the spoiler section. One of the things I think is worth noting is that the character of Bond himself seems to be somewhat malleable. He's the taciturn, quiet man who just listens to what people says and then draws his own conclusions. Later on, he does a lot more plotting, where he's like, well, I need to make these people react in a certain way that gives me evidence against them, so I'm going to do this. And when I do this, they're going to respond in either this way or this way or this way. And based on that, I need to continue my reactions afterwards in such a way that pushes them in the direction that I want them to go. There's even a point, Bond does not have a particularly romantic internal monologue, except at like one point in the book where there's like a page and a half where suddenly he sounds very romantic, and it's so sudden and so abrupt and so short that it almost seems out of place. I would say that it's not necessarily the best character work that I've ever seen in a book, especially in a thriller book where characters are often very important. You know, understanding the character's motivations is important to kind of figuring out how the thriller is going to go. We have other characters, and largely they seem to be built to serve specific purposes. We have our female lead. Her name is Tiffany Case, and she's not particularly well established. She has a very, very basic, very dramatic backstory, and we don't really get a whole lot about the reason why her attraction to Bond is so strong. He doesn't even really try very hard to kind of bring her over to his side, and yet it seems to happen almost without not just without effort on his part, but without even being there to, you know, look manly for his part. It's to the point where it's a little bit hard to believe, honestly. We have a private detective who apparently was part of the Moonraker cast. Felix Leitner serves as kind of a plot glue. Whenever someone needs to get somewhere, but we're not sure how they're going to get there, Felix shows up. Oh, you know what? By the way, I should note that this is actually the fourth Bond book. I went to the library, and they had 3 of them on the shelf, and Diamonds Are Forever just jumped out at me, and so I said, what the heck, I'll read this one. I guess the first one was Casino Royale, which I don't know I don't think that they had that there when I was there at the library. But maybe if they do, I'll go check it out at some point. Anyway, so Felix Leitner serves as a plot glue where when characters need to get from A to B, but we're not sure how, he shows up. And one of the things I noticed about this book is that we don't get a Q scene either. The movies were always famous. From what I remember, the movies always had that little scene with Q where he says, here's gadget A, here's gadget B, and there was always a little bit of humor and kind of technical prowess and a little bit of skepticism on Bond's part often, right? That these gadgets are going to A, be useful, or B, work in the way that they are supposed to work. And we don't get we get like one mention of Q branch in the book where Bond says, oh yes, I need to have some medical stuff some medical forms handed out. I'm going to give those to Q. Q will give them to me, and that way I can get a visa to go to America. Not a particularly engaging appearance of the Q branch. And the plot itself is fairly straightforward, though with some issues, like I said, that I'll explain more in detail in the spoiler section, because I don't want to spoil a thriller. That would be bad. But what I'll say is that there were some significant, I would call them plot oddities, not necessarily plot holes, but parts where things didn't seem to mesh quite right. The basic idea is that they're trying to stop, is that James Bond and, MI6 or whatever, I don't think MI6 is ever mentioned in the book. So maybe that was like something that got added in the movies later or something? I don't know. But anyway, James Bond and his organization working for Great Britain, are trying to stop a diamond smuggling ring, where the diamonds are kind of getting smuggled out of Africa, taken to England, and from England they're getting shipped to America somehow. And nobody's really quite sure exactly how it's being done, but in the briefing, M is already pretty sure that they know who the culprits are. The question is, can we get evidence against them? So the suspect is given early on. It's not really a mystery. There's not really a sense of mystery in this book, generally speaking. It's more about Bond kind of being left on his own to figure out how to stop them, and it's also a big adventure in America. It kind of reminds me, in some sense, of like the Tintin comics, right? Where Tintin goes somewhere and something crazy happens, and he's buffeted along on the rivers of fate. And there's some of that here, although Bond is a little bit more, let's say, proactive in choosing his path than Tintin often was. So, fair enough. But, it's a fairly simple book. It was easy to read, and I think that was done deliberately. And yet, at the same time, it has some good imagery and a few good moments to it. I'll leave the non-spoiler section here, and we're going to move into spoilers where I talk a little bit more in detail about the plot and some of the problems that I think I had with it. So, here we go. All right, spoilers. So, this book starts in a very cool way with a nice hook, which is a short description from the point of view of a scorpion in the desert somewhere in Africa, basically. And, it's kind of tense but interesting, but also a little bit humorous at the end, where a dentist shows up and basically squashes the scorpion. And this dentist guy shows up and he's just sitting there waiting. What he's been doing is he's been helping to smuggle diamonds out of a diamond mine in the area, and he's been handing packets of diamonds to a German helicopter pilot who comes and picks up the diamonds and then flies them away somewhere, and somehow they end up for sale somewhere in America, right? And the introduction of these two characters, the erstwhile dentist smuggler and the German helicopter pilot, are both interesting. They both have good introductions where you're like, oh, cool, this character has some details to his backstory. And they're fairly well written and interesting. And then, I discovered, by the time I finished the book, that this is their only significant appearance in the book, which to me was kind of a disappointment, right? You get these two characters, and Fleming gives them these neat little backstories, and you're like, "Ooh, these will be interesting pieces of the chessboard as the book goes on." And nope, they're just gone, which is kind of sad, honestly. They could have been pretty interesting. Maybe they appear in a later. Well, I know one of them doesn't appear in a later book, but maybe the other one. But the suggestion is that the other one also won't appear in a later book either. So like. It's not like Fleming's introducing these characters to make them interesting later on. I think they're both dead by the end of the book. So from there we jump to Bond in London, and M wants him to work on stopping this diamond smuggling ring. And the plot that they have is for Bond to infiltrate the suspect organization in America, which of course may take some time. Bond will stand in for the person who has been tapped to make the transfer. They look a little similar, and the people who are smuggling the diamonds supposedly don't know this guy that they tapped for it very well either. So, taking advantage of that ambiguity, they grab that guy off the streets and put him in jail somewhere, and then they put Bond out and say, okay, now you're this guy, right? His handler, Bond's handler, is Tiffany Case, who has a very tragic but also kind of shallow backstory. It's one of those things where it's like, yes, there's something there, but it's not told in a very interesting way. Long story short, a particular event, which, YouTube does not like people saying the actual word of, happened to her, which led her to, quote unquote, to sort of, hate men, but she still is a very good diamond smuggler and has some other interesting skills. Fair enough. So, from there, they come up with a plan to help Bond, masquerading as this other guy, basically smuggle some diamonds from England to America. They're going to use some golf balls, which is a pretty neat little artifice there. We get a neat little scene where Tiffany is like, well, what hobbies do you have? What do you do? And he's like, oh, I play cards, I play golf. And she's like, golf, that's it. What we'll do, she kind of asks him, kind of half mockingly, do you have any ideas on how we should smuggle these things? Like, well, I was thinking about like the handles of golf clubs. And she's like, yeah, so does every customs officer, right? No, the solution that she comes up with instead, along with her, superiors in the organization, is to actually hollow out a bunch of golf balls and put some diamonds in there and then plug them up, which sounds harder than they make it out to be in this particular book. But, again, they're golf balls. They don't actually get any real detailed inspection, so I guess it kind of sort of works out. Bond flies to America. Tiffany Case is on the plane to supervise him without, breaking cover or, showing that they're associated. And then we get a bunch of other little mini character introductions on the plane where we get, a cast of characters kind of where, oh, this guy is looking at this, and this guy, I think he's looking at me and might, know something, and, this woman over here is doing this thing, and this guy over here has had this air sickness problem. And so we get a lot of, like, candidates for, like, oh, if there's going to be any other counter spies, who are they going to be? They might be people who are on this plane. Bond lands in America, New York, I believe, with the diamonds. He has his golf balls and golf gear, and he meets Shady Tree, who is the red-headed hunchback I mentioned in the non-spoiler section. And man, when they described him, I thought he really had potential to be a good Bond villain. But again, this is actually his only scene in the whole book. Or he gets like one more little, like, I'm on the other side of a telephone call, and that's it. It's really surprising. And like at the end, he doesn't die at the end of the book, so maybe he shows up in later books. I don't know. But anyway, Shady Tree and his organization have a rather clever method for how to pay mules, basically, right? Instead of just handing Bond the agreed-upon $5,000, what he does is he hands Bond $1,000. He says, you and I had a card game back when I was in England a while back, and I lost $500 to you. When you came to collect here, I offered double or nothing, and I lost, so here's $1,000. And I'm a tax-paying citizen, in good standing, and that's how you got this $1,000 reasonably. And Bond's like, okay, well, fine. What do I do? How do I get the other $4,000? And he says, this is what we'll do. You'll drive to Saratoga, I believe in northern New York, and what you will do is you will bet on a particular horse, on a particular race, and from there, you'll make your $1,000 maybe into $5,000, but maybe into $10,000, maybe into $15,000. And so Bond says, okay, I'll play along. Let's do this. He leaves the meeting with Shady Tree and is immediately caught by like this guy who, since I've never read any other Bond books, I don't know who he was, but he's a man with a hook hand, and turns out this is an old friend from Moonraker, and that is our Felix Leiter. And basically, this is one of the parts where it kind of broke my suspension of disbelief, because they immediately start talking, and Felix is there working for the Pinkertons, trying to break up this diamond smuggling ring. No, he's not trying to break up the diamond smuggling ring. He's trying to deal with horse race fixing, which of course is how Bond is supposed to get the rest of his money. And so Leiter is skulking around trying to get information. He finds Bond. They go get like lunch and a drink together. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. Leiter is supposed to be not undercover, but stealthy, right? He's not supposed to be known to them, but they might have a picture of him somewhere, right? And Bond, is supposed to be this other guy, number one. Number two, he's not, if they think that Leiter is suspicious, and if they're watching Bond, which they very well might be doing, then if they kind of put two and two together, this could be disastrous for either of their missions or both. And so I found it very strange that they actually had this kind of rendezvous and conversation in public. And, it's just treated as like, oh yeah, we'll talk and we'll go and get a drink and talk, and then we'll have dinner later on, and yada, yada, yada. You can drive me up to Saratoga, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, no. You would do something that's way less traceable. Because now that Bond and Felix are together, right? If either one of them has cover problems, then the other one does as well. It would be disastrous for both of them. So that was like the first point where my antenna came up about like the plot having some issues. They do go together to Saratoga, and we get this cool little couple of page thing where Bond is talking about Felix's car. And Felix's car to its outside looks like a plain old Studebaker, but in fact, He's had the Studebaker engine replaced with a high-end Cadillac engine, and so they call it the Studilac. And this is a really cool idea. People used to do this kind of stuff. They still do, right? They hot rod cars, they swap engines, whatever. And this is a really cool idea, and it's like, oh, cool, this Studilac is going to be some kind of important plot point where they have to use it to get away from people that are chasing them or something. And no, it doesn't happen. They do drive in it a couple of times, but there's no intense car chase involving the Studilac being particularly fast and surprising the people that are after them, which also I think is a big wasted opportunity. It's not used effectively in the book. So Felix's job is to hamper this horse race fix. The plan was for this particular horse called Shy Smile to win the race. And the method that they're doing this is actually really weird. What they did was they cut... So according to the book, the way that race horses are identified is with a tattoo on their lip. Okay? And so what this little mafia group has done is they have removed the tattooed skin from, or not, well, maybe, okay, so maybe this makes more sense than I thought. The way that I thought that Fleming described is that they removed the tattooed skin from Shy Smile's lip, which is already bad enough. They got rid of Shy Smile. Shy Smile's been taken care of, taken out behind the woodshed, so to speak. But then Fleming says that they grafted skin onto the ringer, that's the word, the ringer horse, and re-tattooed Shy Smile on that horse. Now what I'm thinking is that maybe they meant they grafted skin from the horse onto itself, because I was going to say, grafting skin from horse A to horse B is really bad, right? Like, just from a medical perspective, this is going to cause all kinds of problems, more than likely, unless these two horses happen to be so closely related, which the suggestion is that they're not. So maybe that makes more sense than I thought first read. I'm kind of discovering this right now as I think about it. Because they say it was a graft, but they didn't I don't remember if they said it was a graft from Shy Smile himself. It might have been a graft of skin from the same horse to itself, and then they re-tattoo Shy Smile on the newly grafted covered lip. That might kind of work. Okay, fair enough. But what Felix is trying to do is to hamper this horse race, which means that Bond isn't going to get his money, or something like that, right? Felix pays off the jockey, and then he enlists Bond to deliver the second payment to the jockey, because it's like 1,000 now and 2,000 after you succeed, right? But and that mostly goes off as planned, but then the way that Bond is going to give the money to the jockey is to be in a mud bath, in his vicinity, and then somehow figure out a way to be like, hey, here's $2,000 from my buddy Felix, right? This is weird too, because now it establishes 3 points of connection between Felix, the jockey, and Bond. And so now they're all three of, the two people who are undercover are now in even more danger. And it turns out that indeed they are in danger, because while they're at the mud bath, Bond is sitting there trying to think of, how am I going to get $2,000 to this guy while we're both in these mud baths? And it's not like a mud bath where you just kind of like get into a jacuzzi full of mud. They like pack you in a little wooden coffin and pour hot mud over every part of you but your face and your heart. Very weird kind of thing there, but that is how it works in the book. And then two guys dash in and they basically rob the mud bath. And what they're really there to do is to punish the jockey for failure. This is a very quick response, and they don't kill the jockey, but they get pretty darn close. So now the question is, okay, we got to get money to him somehow, and hopefully he doesn't squeal or anything like that. But that's what we got to do. So then Bond calls Shady Tree again, and he's like, I didn't get my money. What can I possibly do? He's like, fine. I'm going to wire you another $1,000 that you beat me and that you won from me in cards, wink, and you're going to go to Las Vegas, and you're going to go to a particular table at a particular casino at a particular time, and you're going to bet 4 times, you're going to play 5 times to get your $5,000, or something like that. There's this weird, so Bond now gets onto a plane to go to Las Vegas from New York, and there's this weird little snippet in there where Fleming describes flying past Las Vegas all the way out over the Pacific Ocean, and then turning around to go back to Las Vegas, which seems like a waste of like 300 miles of flight. So I'm not sure what's going on there. There was like a hint that they were going to stop that there was something to do with Los Angeles, but then they don't talk about landing in Los Angeles. They literally just say, flew over Las Vegas, flew over the ocean, turned around, landed in Las Vegas. It's a little bit weird. I'm not sure exactly what to make of that, but it was another point where my realism sensors went off. When he gets there, he has a friend. Well, not a friend, but Felix has a friend named Ernie Curio, who is a taxi driver, and Bond enlists him on a day-by-day basis to take him wherever he needs to go and kind of be a helpful eyes and ears for him. Bond goes to this particular casino. He gets there. He goes to the right table at the right time, and it turns out that Tiffany Case is there as the dealer, which is surprising. That's another big plot convenience. You would think that these organizers would not put these two people back together so quickly. And there wouldn't be much of a reason for her to go all the way to Vegas. So I don't know exactly. Again, it was another point in the plot where I was like, wait, what? This is a little bit too convenient, but okay, fair enough. He wins, as he's supposed to, right? They set up the cards for him so that he wins. But then what he does, rather than stop gambling as they told him to do, is he goes to a different table, a roulette table, and he bets 5 more times. Or he bets a couple more times. He ends up basically with, I think, $20,000 instead of $5,000. Now this is one of those things where it's right here where he's like, okay, now I'm going to take the fight to them. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to take more money from them than I was supposed to have, and we're going to see what happens. Because I think I can probably weasel my way out and say, I didn't understand your instructions. I thought that you meant that I stopped gambling with her, and then the $5,000 is mine, and I can do with it as I will, which would be to gamble elsewhere, maybe. And it's not clear if they were still making him win at the roulette table, which seems possible, but also it wasn't like, oh yeah, this is obviously how we're going to do this. And the question, of course, would be, why would that particular roulette dealer be instructed to let Bond win, right? If they already gave the let Bond win instructions to Tiffany Case, there wouldn't be any reason to tell anybody else in the casino to treat him any differently than just anybody else. So, I don't know. Bond wins a few times. He now has 20 grand. He said he mails 15 grand back to him, not himself, but like his organization in London. And then he takes the 5 and he gets in Ernie's cab, and they discover they have a tail. Not just one tail, but 2 tails. Someone in front, someone in back. And then we have, finally, the first real action scene in the book. We get a chase scene where we get fast driving and going around corners and trying to hide and this and that and the other. We get some gunplay, too. Bond's gun in this book is a 25 ACP Beretta. And the funny thing about 25 ACP is that it's actually a weaker round than like the common 20-22 long rifle that you use for like plinking. And so, I don't know, my favorite 25 ACP joke is that if someone shot me with a 25 ACP and I found out, I'd be pissed. So, anyway, so Bond somehow is very, very lethal with this pea shooter, which fine, he's James Bond, he can shoot very, very well and hit vital spots with this very weak bullet that would probably not pierce a skull. But, anyway, so, turns out that Ernie got shot too, and so they try to hide, they fail at hiding, and Bond gets brought to this, basically it's an old refurbished ghost town that the big bad guy has been rebuilding. And then we get, like, the big bad guy show, there's this scene where they drop him, they bring him there, and he kind of tries to fight them, and he actually does a really good job of fighting them. He knocks the gun out of one of their hands, knocks the gun out of knocks the other one's gun way far away. They struggle over the gun. There's a nice fist fight and all that fun stuff. And finally, Bond almost has the upper hand when, of course, a few new people show up on the scene. One of them being the big bad guy, who's dressed up as a cowboy, which is another wasted point, where it's like, well, you could have had him do some cool stuff with his cowboy gear, but he just doesn't. And then we have two guys who were, Bond, I think, knows were the same guys that robbed the mudbath and took care of the jockey. He's dragged to the enemy base. we don't get a "no, I expect you to die, Mr. Bond" moment, but we get something close to that. Basically, what happens is another major plot issue that I had, where okay, the original plan was for Bond to take the place of this other guy, and so the British police had to grab this guy without anybody knowing and put him somewhere where nobody else would know that he was there. But here's the thing: if Bond's goal was to infiltrate this organization, then it had to be understood that it might take a while for him to do so. And if that's the case, then it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for what happened to happen, right? The police should have been very, very careful to make sure that nobody saw this other guy get picked off the street so that Bond could maintain that disguise. But it turns out that the main bad guy's last name is, what is it? It's something funny. Spang. Their name is Spang, and so it's the Spangled Mob or something like that. But basically what happens is that now Bond is outnumbered. He's got people with guns trained on him. He can't really do anything. They basically beat him to a black and blue pulp without quite breaking any bones. But Spang has a thing that says, the guy that was supposed to be the mule from England to America, he's in police custody. So the guy that you have is a fake for sure. And this is one of those things that, yes, Bond does take the time to try to talk himself out of it, but you would think that it would be very important for that guy for that information to not reach Mr. Spang. That's what I'll say, right? And so this is another point where it's like, well, it could have taken him weeks or months to infiltrate this thing. Obviously, they can't hold this guy for that long, or if they do, they have to be, there has to be enough security that nobody knows who it is, right? But somehow that message gets to Spang, which convinces Spang that Bond is also a ringer, which makes things very, very bad. Then we have another escape. Basically, James Bond is laying on his face, on his stomach, after just being beaten to within an inch of his life, without breaking any bones, by these guys with boots and stuff like that. And Tiffany Case grabs him, puts him on a little hand cart, but it's not quite a hand cart. It has a gasoline engine that she claims she filled up. And they have to make a 50-mile trip to this next city over, which is where they'll be safe, hypothetically. But then, even though she says, I filled the hand cart up right before we left, kind of thing, they're not even halfway to this other city, and suddenly the thing runs out of gas, and she's like, I don't know, this thing's supposed to be able to run, on a full tank, this thing's supposed to be able to run, easily there and back, kind of thing. So there's another weird point that's not very well established. And then we get Bond notices a sound being transmitted through the rails, and he realizes that Spang has taken his locomotive and is chasing them down, and they're never going to be able to outrun him with just his handcart with no gasoline. So this is another weird part of the book where they find a junction, and James says, "Oh, if we take the junction, maybe he'll pass us by." Or Tiffany says that, and James is like, "No, I have a better idea. Here's what we'll do: we'll cross, and then we'll change the junction, and he'll go off in the wrong direction." And for some reason, I guess either he's alone on the thing or what, I'm not sure. But the locomotive passes, it goes down the wrong track. James has 4 shots left in his Beretta and fires them all at Spang. I guess the conclusion is that James Bond hit Spang, and Spang is not able to stop the locomotive because the locomotive continues off on its crazy rampage and ends up crashing and exploding. Which again, I guess it makes sense if you think that Bond hit him 4 times with gunfire as he was passing, which seems hard to do, but again, that's James Bond, fair enough. And that's basically it. The main criminal elements have been dealt with, and the only person who's left is Shady Tree, and Shady Tree don't actually have any evidence to go on him with. He's not done anything. He hasn't given them any evidence that he's done anything illegal. So it's like, well, Bond, you're in pretty bad shape. You're going to need a doctor, and you're going to need some R&R. And Tiffany Case is, well, we're going to bring her over to England, and hopefully she'll be safe here, kind of thing. And so, well, fly back to New York, and we'll put you in a boat and get you back to England. Great, happy ending, right? Wrong. because on that same boat happened to be the two assassins that that nearly killed the jockey, and the two guys that were there when Bond was nearly beaten to death. I forget exactly who did that. It might have been them. But anyway, somehow, despite seeing these people multiple times throughout the book, Bond doesn't remember what they look like, and he's totally off guard for some reason. On the boat, they're sitting there, they're doing their stuff. Bond is finally making a little bit of progress with Tiffany, in the James Bond leading lady sense. And then all of a sudden, Bond wakes up and realizes that those two guys are on the ship with them, and he gets a message, basically. Someone sends him a telegram. There's a lot of vague telegrams, because telegrams are a funny thing in spy stories, right? Because at least two other people than your target are going to get the message. And so all of them have to be written in a way where it's not exactly clear what's being spoken of. But, Bond, obviously, or the receiver, the receiving person has to understand. So we get all these very cryptic telegrams throughout the book. But anyway, Bond is like, oh, there's the two assassins. And so then we get our final major action scene of Bond heroically climbing along on the outside of the ship to take those two guys out and save Tiffany Case, hopefully. And so, yeah, I'll leave that part there. What I'll say is that we do get a conclusion. I won't give too much away for that very ending part. And then you're like, okay, cool, the book is done. But the book's still not done, because what we end up doing is Bond is practically the next scene. Bond is in Africa in a camouflage, some kind of armed truck or something like that. And they are staking out the dentist and the helicopter pilot, because they're going to make that one last trade. And I believe, so what happens is that the dentist is there. So I kind of forgot to mention this. It's not just the Spang people, but there's also this guy who is only known as ABC. And they've been trying to figure out who ABC is throughout the whole book. And then right at the end, right before we get to see Bond kind of sitting there in Africa, they're like, oh, we think ABC is actually this one guy who's working under an alias. Not a very satisfying conclusion, but it makes sense that it was already someone who was a suspect, right? So Bond is there, the helicopter lands, the dentist guy hands over the gems, but the guy who's in the helicopter piloting is not the German anymore. It's ABC, or the person that we suspected was ABC. And so he shoots the dentist, gets onto the thing, tries to fly away. Bond and his guys in the armed vehicle shoot him down. End of story. And that's finally the end of the story. So with that said, I guess let's move on to the conclusion and get some last words. All right. In conclusion, while there were some flaws in this book, and some of them are the kinds of flaws where you think they're a flaw and then you think about it again and maybe they're not as much of a flaw as you thought they were, there still are some flaws in the book. Like, the characters are kind of flat. They're not really that interesting. They're colorful, right? But they're relatively flat. We get what we end up with here is a fun and engaging, easy read. Something that you can just sit down and just kind of go through in one sitting fairly easily. It has a limited vocabulary, but uses it to fairly good effect. It's vivid but simple, and maybe even a little bit repetitive sometimes. I was reading some of the earlier chunks, and it was like, big this, big this, big this, big this. It's like, not even large, huge, enormous, yada, yada, yada. It's a pretty limited repertoire. But at the same time, we get some snappy dialogue, we get some interesting intrigue, we get some characters that are, if not particularly fleshed out, they're at least fun, right? They're interesting. We got the hook hand guy who comes out of nowhere to save the day sometimes. Stuff, not necessarily even save the day, just kind of, again, I said he was like plot glue, right? And he glues parts of the plot that happen in different places together that need that glue. We get a good build-up. We get a lot of dramatic tension, though it's kind of dry on emotion, emotional power. We get some boisterous settings. We get, New York and Las Vegas and, the deserts of Africa, all that fun stuff. Some good set pieces, right? I can see how you would make this into a really good movie, right? Because you'd have a couple of different venues, and you'd have a little action at each venue. You'd kind of be ratcheting up that dramatic tension throughout it. But James Bond himself is not a particularly emotional character, except for that one page where he writes like one of the 1800s romantic writers for like a page, and I'm like, what? And then it's gone. There are some questionable plot points that I thought were a little bit hard to believe sometimes. And my question of this is, maybe this is one of the weaker entries in the Bond series? I don't know. I haven't read any other ones. So it might be worth reading one more, just picking one at random and seeing what I think. Because, for what this is, it's decent. In fact, the front of the book has a quote by Raymond Chandler. Quote, "The remarkable thing about this book is that it is written by an Englishman. The scene is almost entirely American, and it rings true to an American." Which is true. I believe that. "I am unaware of any other writer who has accomplished this," end quote. And that's Raymond Chandler, who's not a nobody, especially in like thriller-style writing. So maybe this is just a weak entry? I don't know. I probably will read another one of these someday, but not champing at the bit to do it. So, would I recommend this book? If you're a James Bond fan, if you like the movies, maybe to yes, right? Maybe this is one of the weaker books. I'll know more when I read another one. I'll be able to say this is, I'll be able to answer whether this is typical or whether this is below average, right? Hopefully, right? But if you like James Bond and you've never read one of the books, you could read this book. It's short, it's easy, it's quick. You get to see where things came from. It's early in the series too, so it's not like there's so much backstory built up for other things that you have to worry about. You can just kind of read this by itself, and the only thing that you get really are a couple of references to Moonraker, and that's about it. If you like spy thrillers and you've never read an Ian Fleming James Bond book, maybe worth a shot. I wouldn't go so far as to say definitely, but I would say, if you like spy thrillers and you've never read Ian Fleming, you should probably read some Ian Fleming. Maybe not this particular book. Maybe you should look for the Casino Royale, the first Bond book, might be a better place to start. And if you go look and say, what's the best Ian Fleming James Bond book? Maybe there's an answer that's not this one, right? Possible. If you're not at least somewhat friendly to this kind of actiony spy thriller genre, I don't know that this book is for you. I would say that you might find, first off, if you're not already friendly to the genre, you're not going to find that this is a particularly amazing example of the genre. But so I would say, if you don't like spy thrillers at all, if you're sure that you kind of don't like spy thrillers, or you're almost sure, and you're like, well, I want to make sure, right? This wouldn't be the place to go, because you'll come off of this saying, it's mediocre, it's okay. But, I'm sure there are much better spy thrillers that you can find other than this particular book. And of course, some of them might be written by Ian Fleming as well. I just don't know. So, yeah, that's kind of my thoughts. It's a fun book, but it's got its flaws. It is a little bit flat. We have we have colorful but kind of weakly fleshed out characters. But we do get some good dramatic tension. We do get some good action. And, a good kind of weekend read for, I'm just kind of doing something to pass a little time. Not something that I wouldn't say that this particular book is, amazing in any sense. But yeah, that's what I've got. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this review. I'm going to continue reading Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I also have a relatively short Poirot book that I might do next week if I'm still not done with this, which is entirely possible. And I also have Jimmy and the Crawler, which might be worth a review sometime soon as well, because I do like Feist a lot. So that's what I've got. As always, thanks for watching, thanks for listening. Anything you want to do to support the channel, the usual YouTube stuff, links in the description, all that good nonsense. And have a good rest of your week, and I'll see you next time. Have a good one.